Dwayne Johnson overhears his bodyguard's desperate call. His daughter is sick and he can't afford treatment. What The Rock does next stuns everyone. The cameras flashed, the crowd roared, and the energy was electric. Dwayne Johnson had lived this moment countless times. Another premiere, another red carpet, another wave of applause. But tonight, something was off. He could feel it, even before he knew why. His security team moved with precision, keeping everything in control. Among them was Frank Harris, a man Dwayne trusted with his life. Frank wasn't just another bodyguard. He was sharp, professional, always calm under pressure, a man who never showed weakness. But tonight, something was different. As Dwayne walked toward his car, shaking a few hands on the way, he noticed it. Frank wasn't his usual self. His steps were slower, his shoulders slumped just slightly, his eyes carrying a weight that wasn't there before. It wasn't exhaustion from work. It was something deeper. Then it happened. Just as Dwayne settled into the back seat of his car, Frank stepped aside to take a phone call. His voice was low, urgent. "No, I don't have it yet," he whispered, his back turned slightly. "Please, I just need a little more time." Dwayne wasn't the type to eavesdrop, but something about Frank's tone made him stop. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't annoyance. It was desperation. And then came the words that sent a chill down his spine. "She's just a little girl. I can't lose her." Dwayne's stomach dropped. A little girl? Who was he talking about? Frank had always been a rock, unshaken, unbreakable. But now, standing just a few feet away, he looked like a man barely holding himself together. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightened. For the first time, Dwayne saw fear in his eyes. Something wasn't right. As Frank ended the call and turned back toward the car, his expression snapped back to normal. Professional, guarded, as if nothing had happened. But Dwayne had seen the crack in the armor, and once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. Dwayne leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowing. Frank had spent years protecting him. Now, for the first time, it was Dwayne's turn to protect Frank. Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling. The words Frank had whispered over the phone kept ringing in his head. "She's just a little girl. I can't lose her." It wasn't just concern. It was fear. A fear Dwayne had never seen in Frank before. The next morning, Dwayne arrived at his gym for an early workout, and as expected, Frank was already there, standing by the entrance, alert as always. He looked like his usual self, calm, composed, unreadable. But now Dwayne saw through it. He noticed the dark circles under Frank's eyes, the stiffness in his movements, the way he kept adjusting his hands like they were aching from exhaustion. "Didn't sleep much, huh?" Dwayne asked casually, tossing his gym bag onto the bench. Frank smirked, shaking his head. "Nah, just a long night." Dwayne watched him for a second. He wasn't the type to pry, but something told him Frank wasn't going to admit what was really going on unless he had no choice. So, he tried a different approach. "How's the family, man?" Dwayne asked, stretching his arms. "I don't think I've ever heard you talk about them." Frank hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but that hesitation spoke volumes. "They're good," he said, his voice even. Too even. "My wife, Monica, she's holding things down at home." "And your little girl?" Dwayne pressed, keeping his tone light. Frank inhaled, his shoulders lifting with the weight of something he had been carrying alone. He let out a quiet sigh before finally speaking. "Lily. She's 7. She's sick." His voice dipped slightly, cracking just enough for Dwayne to catch it. Dwayne's stomach tightened. "Sick how?" Frank hesitated again. Then he finally looked up. "She's got a heart condition. It's been getting worse. Doctors say she needs surgery and soon." He clenched his jaw, looking away. "Insurance barely covers anything. I've been picking up extra shifts, doing whatever I can to come up with the rest." Dwayne felt something in his chest tighten. He had known Frank for years, trusted him with his own safety, but Frank had been fighting a silent war this whole time. "How much are we talking?" Dwayne asked, his voice steady. Frank exhaled, shaking his head. "More than I can make in time." He let out a small, tired laugh. "But I don't have a choice. I'm her dad. I have to figure it out." Dwayne looked at the man standing before him, a father drowning under the weight of a battle he refused to lose. And in that moment, he made a decision. Frank wouldn't fight this alone anymore. Dwayne sat in his car after leaving the gym, his mind racing. He had faced challenges his whole life. Tough fights, impossible odds, moments where the weight of the world felt crushing. But this was different. This was a father fighting for his child, and Dwayne knew there was no battle more personal than that. Frank wasn't just a bodyguard. He was a man who had spent years protecting others, yet no one had been there to protect him from this storm. Dwayne couldn't let that stand. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "I need numbers," he said the moment his financial manager picked up. "Find out how much the best possible treatment for a kid's heart surgery costs." "Whose kid?" the voice on the other end asked. "Doesn't matter," Dwayne replied. "Just get me the numbers. And one more thing. I want to know every single expense Frank has. Bills, mortgage, loans, everything." The next few hours were a blur. Dwayne's team worked fast, and by the end of the day, he had everything he needed. The amount was high, but not high enough to be impossible. He had spent more on cars, on watches, on things that didn't matter. But this was a life. He could have just wired the money and been done with it. But Frank wasn't the type of man to accept charity. If Dwayne really wanted to help, he had to do it right. With respect, with dignity. That's when the idea hit him. He picked up his phone and made another call. "Set up a meeting with Frank," he said. "Tell him it's important." Dwayne leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding with a mix of anger, sadness, and determination. Frank had carried this weight alone for too long. That ended today. Frank arrived at the hotel, adjusting the cuffs of his worn-out suit jacket. Dwayne had asked him to meet here, saying it was important, but something felt off. He had worked with The Rock long enough to know that the man didn't waste time on unnecessary meetings. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about security. As he walked through the grand entrance, a hotel staff member guided him to a private conference room. The doors swung open, and the sight that greeted him made him freeze. Sitting inside were his wife, Monica, and his little girl, Lily. His heart stopped. What's going on?" he asked, stepping inside cautiously. Then he saw Dwayne standing by the window, hands in his pockets, watching him with a small, knowing smile. Frank turned back to Monica, confused. "Why are you here?" His wife smiled through tears. "Dwayne called me." Frank looked at The Rock, his pulse quickening. "Why would you do that?" Dwayne motioned toward a chair. "Sit, brother." Frank hesitated, his instincts screaming that something big was about to happen. But he sat. Dwayne pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "Open it." Frank swallowed, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted the cover. Inside were medical documents, hospital forms, and a letter from one of the country's top heart surgeons. His eyes darted across the words, trying to process what he was seeing. "I made some calls," Dwayne said, his voice steady. "Lily's surgery is booked. Full treatment, the best doctors, no waiting lists." Frank blinked, his mind struggling to keep up. "But it's done," Dwayne cut in. "Paid in full." Frank's hands shook, his throat burned. "Dwayne, I can't let you—" "You can," Dwayne interrupted, leaning forward. "And you will." Frank's breath hitched. His entire body felt like it had been hit by a truck. But then Dwayne did something unexpected. He pushed another folder toward him. "And this," he said, "takes care of everything else." Frank opened it, his vision blurring as he saw paid-off debts, a mortgage cleared, a trust fund set up for Lily. Every financial burden he had been breaking his body for, gone. His chest tightened, his hands clenched into fists, trying to hold himself together. I don't know what to say, he whispered. Dwayne placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything. Monica covered her mouth, tears spilling freely. Lily, unaware of the weight of the moment, giggled as she climbed onto Frank's lap. Dwayne smiled. You've spent your life protecting others. Let someone have your back for once. Frank couldn't hold it in anymore. His head dropped, shoulders shaking as tears silently fell. For the first time in years, he felt like he could finally breathe. Frank sat there, frozen, his hands gripping the papers as if they might disappear. His whole life he had been the strong one, the provider, the man who never asked for help. But now, sitting in this room with his wife and daughter, with Dwayne Johnson looking at him like a brother rather than a boss, the walls he had built around himself started to crumble. Monica reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly, her eyes filled with relief. Frank, she whispered, her voice shaking. It's over. We don't have to fight alone anymore. Lily, too young to understand the weight of what had just happened, climbed onto her father's lap and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. Daddy, why are you crying? She asked innocently. Frank let out a soft, broken laugh, pressing his forehead against hers. Because, baby girl, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sometimes happy tears are the best kind. Dwayne watched, his chest tight, knowing that this moment wasn't about charity or pity. It was about honoring a man who had given everything without expecting anything in return. Frank wiped his face, looking up at Dwayne with blurry eyes. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice raw. Dwayne smiled, shaking his head. You don't have to. Just promise me one thing. When someone else needs a hand one day, you'll be the guy who reaches out. Frank nodded, swallowing hard. I will. The room fell into silence, heavy with emotions too deep for words. And in that moment, one thing was clear. Frank's fight was no longer his to carry alone. Some moments in life remind us that true strength isn't about how much we can carry alone. It's about knowing when to accept help. Dwayne Johnson didn't just change Frank's life. He showed the world what real kindness looks like. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. And before you go, check out the videos appearing on your screen. You won't want to miss them.